Minister.
Minister, President Minister Cassis, we're very pleased to see you here in person to partake in this meeting. Congratulations, Switzerland, on the start of your Security Council presidency. For your country, your maiden presidency is indeed a historic occasion, and we wish you every success. We'd like to thank the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Mr. Volker Turk, as well as Ms. Chigvenia and Ms. Aloni Sakin for their briefings. Mr. President, it's obvious that there's a deep-seated divide between the positions of UN member states. In order to overcome this crisis, we need joint efforts to come up with an updated, more sustainable international security architecture. In this context, the trust deficit and the lack of a unifying agenda are particularly relevant. Since we're on the topic of trust, we cannot but mention the treacherous activities of our former Western partners. Over the last 15 to 20 years, they've managed to destroy, step by step, the green shoots of mutual understanding and cooperation, which had sprung up after the end of the Cold War. I'm referring to broken promises about no eastwards expansion of NATO. I'm referring to the promotion of so-called color revolutions, toppling regimes not to these Western powers' liking. I'm also referring to the attempt to impose a so-called rules-based order on everybody, replacing international law and respect for the UN Charter. Thanks to their efforts, today we live in a world where truth is worthless, where the media, controlled by the collective West, are planting misanthropic attitudes which are mendacious to the core. We're being told that white is black and vice versa. It goes without saying that I'm referring first and foremost to the situation in Ukraine. Thanks to the efforts of the US and their allies, Ukraine has been relegated to a pawn in the geopolitical confrontation between Russia and the West. To that end, at our borders, for 8 years, they've been installing a Russophobic neo-Nazi dictatorship, which has proclaimed war on everything Russian and everything that objectively bound us together. The situation has gotten so far out of hand that we now have a proxy war which NATO is waging against Russia, rising the spectre of the most nefarious consequences for all of humanity. How can there be any talk about trust under the circumstances? It's obvious that the Western powers' actions are having a direct impact on the potential for cooperation of the world's leading players seeking to settle regional crises. For Western countries, they see all of this through the prism of Sino-Russian competition, a zero-sum game. We categorically disagree with such an approach. This state of affairs, international affairs, without a doubt has an influence on the work of the UN Security Council and other international fora. We see deep-seated disagreements on a large number of topics being discussed by the General Assembly. All of this is seriously testing the resilience of the UN and affecting the effectiveness of the UN's efforts to discharge its mandate, that is, the prevention of conflict and peacekeeping. One of the telltale signs of the situation is the crisis surrounding the implementation of existing agreements and deals, as well as resolutions adopted by main UN bodies. If the aforementioned documents are no longer furthering the interests of Western states, well, these states are hushing up the fact that they aren't being implemented, the documents themselves being deemed irrelevant or simply rejected. This crisis of trust has had a most direct impact on mediation. This trend is most glaring in the case of the Minsk agreements on Ukraine and the role Germany and France played in reaching these agreements. Paris and Berlin, well, not only did they fail to get Kiev to implement the Minsk agreements, but they later admitted that the goal of signing the agreements, well, the goal was to give the Ukrainian regime time to prepare for war. Unfortunately, these trends are not limited to a few states. They've had an influence on all of the UN's work. Of late, we're witnessing an erosion of trust in our organization, an organization which is called upon to represent the interests of all member states, to be the epitome of impartiality and integrity. Its personnel is duty-bound to comply unswervingly with Article 100 of the UN Charter. We see this not only when it comes to the political track, especially to the human rights work of the organization, but we're also seeing it in the field, in countries hosting UN missions. That is, at the very level where the political decisions we reach are supposed to be put into practice. A problem that deserves our close attention is the rise of disinformation and false information about the UN, which has been discussed a great deal of late in various UN fora. This problem, in our view, requires a comprehensive solution, because negative feedback about the UN is not always an attempt to tarnish the organization's reputation. Some of these critical assessments attest to the disappointment of host states and their people. We shouldn't turn away from this information. On the contrary, in response, peacekeeping missions of the United Nations must clarify their mandates. They must reinforce outreach to ordinary people via radio and television, and must also implement local quick impact projects, or QIPs. This may help to establish constructive cooperation with the host parties, building a relationship based on trust, thereby burnishing the UN's reputation. President, inclusion and due regard for the opinions of all parties are the building blocks of trust-based relationships at both the international and country level, especially where conflicts rage. Domestic crises cannot be resolved unless we take into consideration the interests of all groups of the population. This process is complicated, it's painstaking, it's frequently lengthy, and what's important to underscore, it must be a national process. There is no one-size-fits-all solution. We need to look for unique recipes based on the specific social, ethnic, cultural, civilization, and historic characteristics of each given society. Such a lasting social contract can only be reached and maintained by a specific state. The role of the international community boils down to providing requisite political support, sharing experience, and extending humanitarian and economic assistance. All of this must be done with full respect for the sovereignty of the host state. Interfering in the domestic affairs of another state has never gotten lasting results to date. What's more is, such interference not only runs the risk of becoming an insuperable obstacle to building trust between the main players, it can also bring about state collapse. This brings me to another manifestation of this crisis of trust, that is the watering down of the role of national governments, who are supposed to represent the interests of their own populace. Frequently, we've seen information provided by the authorities of a number of countries. Well, that information has been almost automatically thrown into doubt. Supposedly, this information needs to be confirmed by the opposition, civil society, or other structures. At the same time, data received from some NGOs is being taken at face value, no questions asked. Furthermore, the more a given government tries to chart an independent course, often not to the liking of former centers of power or not to the liking of the self-styled world's policemen, the more blatant the use of the aforementioned approach. Here at the Security Council, we hear briefings by dozens of various representatives from within and outside the UN system. We try to get as much information as possible, but it's vital to understand that no NGO testimony can replace information provided by governments. Attempts to affirm the opposite is an attack on the intergovernmental nature of the United Nations. We stand convinced that a constructive role in assisting states' efforts to ensure the well-being and security of their citizens can be played by regional integration bodies, which know firsthand about the problems their members face. Specifically, we'd like to hail the efforts of the African Union and other countries on the African continent which have been deployed to build an inclusive and diverse African society which remains united by virtue of their common history and culture. To conclude, we'd like to note that there's only one way to shoring up trust, that is, dialogue on an equal footing, a desire and readiness to listen and to hear. It's also about factoring in each other's positions and interests in good faith. It's about understanding that security of one party cannot be shored up at the expense of another. It's equally important to return to a culture of consensus building, which in today's day and age has been seriously undermined. We've expounded on this position in our contribution to the Secretary General's new agenda for peace. We hope that our approaches will be reflected therein. Thank you very much.